Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second session of Abducting the Future, Epistemic Struggle in Western Strategic Thought with Samuel Forsythe. My name is Martina Francesca Cavalot, and I'm your moderator for this seminar. Sam, take it away.
Thank you very much. So, last session was quite a lot, both for myself and I imagine for everybody else. So I want to start today's session with a bit of a review of some of the things that I went through last session, just to try and refresh our understanding of the context, the purpose, and the problem of this session. I'm also going to try and slow things down a bit and also to work a bit more from organized, prepared text rather than trying to sort of do it in a more conversational fashion, which I tried last time. But I think it'll be fine. So for anyone who wasn't here for the first session or who can't remember the first session at all, the purpose of the seminar, so abducting the future, abduction being the mode of inference or reasoning that is responsible or that we use to produce explanatory hypotheses. The term comes from the philosophy of Charles Sanders Peirce. Peirce was a so Peirce lived at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. He saw himself primarily as a logician, but he made contributions to philosophy, mathematics, chemistry, metrology, a sort of massive array of scientific fields, and his entire sort of architectonic philosophy was concerned with the broader problems of inquiry. So the means by which we go about seeking true knowledge about the world. Truth for Peirce was not something given in the world to which perfect concepts correspond, nor was it something that we merely construct together, though both of these definitions of truth or ideas of truth played a role in his philosophy. Truth for Peirce was the consensus of opinion or the view on which we would arrive were our inquiries ever to be taken as far as they could go. So for Peirce, the idea of inquiry, the idea of seeking knowledge was supposed to be fallible. We are supposed to accept that we don't, that a lot of what we currently believe might be false and that we desire to learn more. It should be open. We should not obstruct inquiry. That also doesn't only mean politically, but also in our thought. And inquiry is also a collective and necessarily collaborative procedure. While we may be capable of being rigorous, being logical, being implacable, being persistent and precise, any results we come up with will inevitably have things wrong with them. And so it is up to the community of inquiry to confirm, to verify, to falsify, and ultimately over time converge on things that are no longer susceptible to doubt. This was, of course, one of his most diplomatic ways of putting it. Things that we can determine are true are things about which we are no longer reasonably able to hold any doubts. And inquiry, for Peirce, especially organized, systematic inquiry, of which science is, of course, the best, but not the only sort of exhaustive example, could only use the tools that we are born with. The only tools we have are the cognitive capacities that everyone is born with. And in formal terms, Peirce saw the tools of inquiry from a purely sort of logical perspective as basically being the three types of inference. Abduction, the means of generating an explanatory hypothesis for a surprising event. deduction, which is drawing necessary conclusions from premises, and induction, which is drawing probable consequences, enumerative statistical probabilities about the recurrence of events. So abduction tells us what might be. Deduction tells us what necessarily must be. And induction tells us what probably will be. Abduction is the part of inquiry that happens at the beginning. Something surprising happens, and we seek to explain it. And if it's not explicable by something familiar, then we have to come up with a new thought, a new concept, a new hypothesis. Deduction allows us to take our hypothesis and determine its necessary consequences. If this were to be true, then the following would also occur as a consequence, which then allows us to formulate predictions, theories. Induction then is the largely experimental process of controlling, repeating, and enumerating the likelihood of some event. And one of Peirce's sort of most trenchant insights with regard to the logic of inquiry was that abduction is the only means by which any new knowledge can really be produced. Everything that in the conclusion of a deduction is already contained in the premises. It merely explicates the premises and their consequences. An induction, despite the fact that it may be able to overcome all kinds of randomness, variation, deviation, noise, anomalies through its enumerative function, still cannot really tell us anything other than that something that we suspect to be the case will happen again. Neither deduction nor induction, which are the two major inferences or forms of argument in classical logic, neither is really capable of introducing something genuinely new or explaining something genuinely surprising. And so abduction we could consider as the logic of discovery. So Peirce was his whole life deeply concerned with the questions around abduction and discovery and how it is that we come to know new things. And from his work on abduction and inquiry, mathematics, logic, he developed a very complex and very rich philosophy, a lot of which we might today call epistemology. Peirce is also well known as the founder of pragmatism, pragmatic philosophy, though his philosophy differs very significantly from William James, John Dewey, Richard Rorty, and sort of, the people who came after him in the pragmatist tradition. We can go into that later. He also developed concurrently, but very, I would say, much more systematically, the theory of signs, or semiotics. Peirce's semiotic theory is not based on a dyadic relationship, a binary relationship between sign and signifier, but on a triadic relationship. There's always, so any sign always refers to three things. You have the representamen, the thing doing the representing, the sign itself. You have the object to which the sign refers, and then you have the interpretant. And the interpretant is the concept. It's the thought. It's the what occurs to someone or any mind or pseudo-mind that encounters a sign, and it tells them about the relationship between the sign and the object. These three aspects, so these also extend to different kinds of signs. There are signs which are predominantly iconic, which works through resemblance. Things look like other things. They are similar to other things. And this is a largely sort of formal relationship. Icons are images or other representations that mimic in some way some formal quality or characteristic of their object. So an emoji is an icon. It has also symbolic features. We can talk about this some other time, but it resembles a face. But a diagram is also an icon because it resembles the relationship between the parts of some complex proposition. Iconicity and that kind of semiotic activity is all about looking like appearances. And the relationship between sign and object is also arbitrary. There is no necessary connection. Things merely appear. It is the world of appearances. And this corresponds to Peirce's first metaphysical category of firstness, which is potential, possibility, quality independent of actuality. The second kind of sign, which Peirce derives from his second category of actuality or resistance, struggle, the relationship between two things independently of any third. And for secondness, the typical sign type is the index. With an index, the relationship between the representamen, between the signifying element, the sign vehicle, and the object to which it refers, is a necessary causation or a real causation, a real relationship. A footprint in the sand is an index of an actual interaction between a body and a surface, but a barometer or a weather vane are equally index. A pointing finger is an index because the directionality of the finger itself refers to a real, geometric, but nonetheless real relationship between whatever the object is and the sign itself. Indexes are what we usually take as evidence. Footprints, blood spatter, DNA samples. We can think of the sort of the sundry elements of sort of forensics. Indexes are generally conceived as being much more reliable kinds of signs. And the index is, of course, the type of sign that inductive inquiry is mostly concerned with. And the last kind of sign is the symbol. And the symbol corresponds to Peirce's category of thirdness. So we have firstness, quality, being independently of anything else, difficult to imagine. Secondness, actuality, struggle, resistance, things really interacting. And thirdness is mediation. Thirdness is how things interact, or the laws or habits or regularities that mediate between the real interaction of things. So thirdness is the entire domain of meaning, of language, of symbols, but also of techniques, instruments. All intentional intervention in the world takes place in the domain of thirdness. And the symbol, of course, is a sign that is interpreted as a general. Usually a symbol is defined in the Peircean sense as a sign that is interpreted as a convention. There are norms, codes, rules about how a certain sign ought to be interpreted. A peace sign means peace, I guess. A red heart means strong emotion of a good type. There's all kinds of things that we can imagine, but of course every word is a symbol. Concepts are symbols. It is the largest category of sign, given that it sort of contains all human representations. And the forms of inference also have a relationship to the different kinds of signs. So abduction as the exploratory, tentative form of inference has very much to do with firstness, how things might be, how things seem. I have a hunch, I have a suspicion. I suspect there might be something hidden. I notice an irregularity that reminds me of another time when I discovered a completely different irregularity, but in that case, it led me to something surprising. So I will also use that here. Abduction is the discovery of the unknown through the suggestion of what is possible. Of course, deduction has absolute security from a logical perspective. If as long as the premises are true, the conclusions will be true. Induction has slightly less security. That my conclusions are probably true. But neither of those have much of what Peirce called uberty. He loved to coin terms. He didn't do it arbitrarily. He took it very seriously, but you know, his rather sort of unfortunate career as an outsider, sort of locked out of the philosophical establishment, meant that he developed a lot of terms that no one told him not to use. Uberty was one, but Uberty referred to the productivity of a concept or the productivity of an idea. And so some concepts have security and some have uberty. So abduction has a lot of uberty and almost no security, because everyone knows whenever we come up with reasons for why things might have happened, especially when they appear plausible to us, we are often just as likely to be wrong as we are to be right. This is, of course, the central problematic of guessing, and not just arbitrary wild guessing, but even so-called educated guesses we can see them as abductions, and we all know how wrong those can go. Peirce, however, was convinced, and he has a whole sort of ontology that he uses to support this, that our abductive capacity is essentially something we've developed as a consequence of evolution, that our consciousness, our cognition, our epistemic operations, our perceptions are necessarily attuned to the world because we are in and of the world. We are as much a part of the world as everything else. And so there's no reason to assume that the sort of instincts and capacities of let's say, animals would be denied to us. So he saw abduction on the one hand as a sort of instinct, something that takes place in the part of perception and cognition that is before we gain any conscious control. And we know this also today, that visual and all kinds of perceptual cognitive processes involve, in large part, anticipation. We are constantly simulating, expecting, anticipating, guessing at what the world in front of us actually contains. And so, he also saw perception as containing abductions already. We assume that the contents of our perception are plausible and true. But for him, anything like that was beyond comment, and anything outside of conscious control cannot be subjected to critique. So the aspect of abduction that Peirce was interested in was the formulation of explanatory hypotheses within the context of inquiry, systematic search for answers to puzzling questions. So, abducting the future as a setup for the seminar was originally about the ways that international political actors, I mainly look at states and political actors with state-like capacities. I was originally thinking to look at how they approach the goal of predicting what's going to happen. This led me into an interest in a certain field of security discourse. So we discussed last week security discourse being a very broad term from international relations that means something like the sum or dominant discussions amongst actors who make decisions or formulate ideas about what is good, right, and possible in the world of international relations, and especially security involving domestic security, national security, warfare, strategy, and all the major sort of elements of sovereign power. My interest in, competition over knowledge about things to come, or knowledge of what might be, led me to focus a little bit more on what I see as a slightly more pertinent problem of the present, which in the sort of updated syllabus and in last week's seminar I referred to by this very broad concept of epistemic struggle. Simply put, I would say that epistemic struggle is a mode of discourse that's currently very influential in international relations. And it is a way of thinking about and behaving within the context of international politics in such a way that knowledge production, and especially the production of political knowledge, is both securitized, so something that needs to be protected, something that is threatened, something that needs to have exceptional measures brought to bear upon it to protect it from threats and enemies. So knowledge production has been securitized, and it's also been weaponized, which is to say, to have been made into an instrument of power and an instrument of harm. And the fields where these discourses really sort of come together are, on the one hand, in the politics of disinformation and in the politics of intelligence. The recent turn towards disinformation as a major international security threat and an existential threat, not simply a problem, but a threat to the policy documents and think tanks, scholars alike sort of frequently cite disinformation as a threat to democracy, a threat to the truth, a threat to the foundations of the liberal, democratic, capitalist state. And in the discourse of disinformation, which, as I outlined, is ultimately concerned not with information or with truth or the sort of, the terms that are used within the discourse itself, but center on the problem of deception. Questions of disinformation, propaganda, influence campaigns, surprise military attacks, subversive operations, ultimately all center on the problem of deception, being deceived, having signs in the world and our knowledge of it, especially our political knowledge, be manipulated, right, in such a way that we will ourselves choose to pursue ends and means that are to our own disadvantage. We all are familiar with the concept of deception in an everyday way. And so I found it very curious that the entire major political discourse of disinformation and falsehood rarely goes into the theory of deception. And at the same time, the entire discourse of epistemic struggle is about securitizing the search for political knowledge. Not only what is considered true, we have to fix what is true, we have to develop institutions that can certify truth and can approve truth. It's not only about epistemic authority, but it is about a struggle over who has the power to inquire, who is allowed to make an inquiry, but also how do we go about it? How do we seek knowledge? How do we verify knowledge? How do we generate new hypotheses about complex, contingent, uncertain events? And in contemporary politics, the practices of inquiry and the communities of inquiry have both been securitized. In authoritarian societies, inquiry is securitized. It is protected. You have censorship, you have control, you have a fear of inquiry, openness and publicity, communal cooperative inquiry is a threat to certain norms, the same way that deception is seen as a threat to norms within liberal states. And what is one of the major, and of course the other element is of course intelligence. And this is where we see that inquiry is not so much securitized, although within the whole domain and problem of secrecy, that's very much the securitization of inquiry. But in intelligence, we see that inquiry has been weaponized. Rather than it being a cooperative, collaborative practice, inquiry is made an instrument of advantage, an instrument of strategic advantage. The problem, of course, and this becomes clear from a reading of Peirce, and not only Peirce, this is almost common sense, is that the instrumentalization, the securitization or weaponization of inquiry, which is not only rigorous and effective in its methods, but necessarily collaborative and public in its sort of institutionalization. Both the securitization and weaponization of inquiry defeat the very premises of inquiry. It's not that the community of inquiry, which was for Peirce necessarily limitless. Everyone who has ever lived and who may ever live belongs in theory to the community of inquiry. And it is necessarily so, otherwise there is no way to converge over time towards things that might be true. By weaponizing and overly securitizing inquiry, we actually inhibit its ability to function. So looking at how states go about generating knowledge about uncertain situations, I found that there was this conflict, this epistemic struggle between practices of detecting knowledge. So I use detection to signify the weaponized variant of inquiry. So whereas inquiry is collective and public, detection is instrumental, focused on advantage. So on the one hand, there are methods of detection, intelligence, espionage, all manner of information gathering, and deception, disinformation, propaganda, various ways of putting out manipulative signs. So detection tries to abductively acquire secrets. So the whole process of espionage, as we'll discover in a later seminar, is, as much as people in the intelligence community sort of aspire to scientific rigor, they are very much locked into the abductive domain. There is very little that they can inductively verify. And so political knowledge generally on that level stays in the form of a hypothesis, which means that certainties are difficult to achieve. Detection on the one hand and deception on the other. So you have the search for signs of hidden opportunity, the search for signs of hidden advantage. Detection is an instrument of power in that sense. It helps us discover hidden affordances. Affordances are action opportunities embedded in the environment. This is it's a term from ecological psychology from J.J. Gibson. And detectives, those seeking affordances, are engaged in a sort of logically necessary struggle with deceivers. If detection is a kind of inquiry, deception we can see as a kind of counter-inquiry. While the ultimate goal of a deceiver is certainly to perhaps conceal some truth or propagate some falsehood, the activity of a deceiver is not focused on those consequences. The activity of a deceiver, the action, the technique, the skill of any deceiver at any level, whether it's an individual or a state, is focused on manipulating their adversary's inquiry, specifically the means, the mediation, the instruments, the signs, the concepts, the evidence that their target is using for their inquiry. When I deceive somebody, yes, I want to achieve a certain relationship between myself and them and some fact, some state of the world. But more than anything, I want to inhibit their ability to inquire. I want to conceal that there is anything to find. And if I can't do that, I want to obscure the nature of what there is to find. And if I can't do that, then I want to mislead how those clues will follow, sort of the conclusions that would follow from such clues. by manipulating them, adding false clues. If I can't do that, so if I can't lead someone to, proceed from false premises, I can insert noise into the environment. I can, make the data messy, create fake phenomena. I can manipulate the very instruments that are used for the measurements of induction. Through each stage of inquiry, there are moments when a deceiver can intervene. So if we are merely formulating ideas about what is possible and deriving that from limited information that may or may not have some actual relationship to the objects of our problem, if I've only got a few clues, if I only have incidental or anecdotal evidence, or if there's limited time, let's say information scarcity is probably the most important dynamic here. And I only have abductions. Of course, abduction is a stage of inquiry is the most susceptible to deception. And I will talk later about why I think that deception, in fact, only targets abduction, that deception is adversarial abduction, essentially. I can't manipulate a deduction. It has necessary conclusions. I can only manipulate its premises. I can feed you a false premise and convince you that it's true, or I can take something that you believe to be true and manipulate it while concealing that fact and so you carry on thinking that something that was true still is. And in a way, I've stolen one of your premises and replaced it with a mere hypothesis. Induction, of course, is designed to overcome things like deception. Induction overcomes randomness, variation, and it does so by being iterative and repetitive and controlled. In a relationship, let's say in a war or an adversarial relationship between two intelligence services, the control and repetition of a scientific inductive scenario is not available. It's not possible. You can't really experiment. So the judgments, political judgments, let's say policies, strategic decisions, operational decisions, are formed largely on the basis of abductions. So this, of course, clarifies why political disputes on securing truth in international politics are a bit absurd, because ultimately the knowledge that we're talking about here is abductive. We are not talking about ideas or problems or concepts that have gone through systematic cycle of abduction, deduction, induction over and over and over again in practice across a wide community. We are talking about limited insights into contingent and quite rapid events that are constantly changing. So this is why I thought it would be better to look at inquiry rather than truth, or at the relationship between inquiry and counter-inquiry, detection and deception, rather than only at the question of trying to understand the future. Because, of course, abduction is both reconstructive, as a classic police or fictional detective. I'm looking to draw on signs from which I can make abductive inferences to recreate the causes of a crime. Or I can use it predictively. I can look at circumstances and try to come up with what I think might result as a consequence. So in thinking about epistemic struggle, what my core concern, which I guess, sort of ethics of the seminar, is that at the current moment, there is a very wide-ranging and very influential move amongst the great and slightly less great state powers, the cores, the imperial cores, however you want to sort of talk about them. State actors, influential state actors, are very concerned with securitizing and weaponizing the conduct and the community of inquiry. This is obviously not an ideal state of affairs, given that human society produces problems faster than it can currently solve them. And so more than anything, we need our communities of inquiry to function well and to be as radically open and collaborative as possible, since it's the only way to ensure that there's enough searching for knowledge going on at any given time. So one thing I wanted to look at, so we've got epistemic struggle, this conflict between actors, adversarial meaning not simply competing, but with an enemy, with an adversary who is dangerous, from whom harm can come as a consequence, an adversary who is implacable, who cannot be stopped or reasoned with or otherwise persuaded. And in the case of epistemic struggle, very specifically, the enemy image of an epistemic enemy is that the enemy is cunning. The enemy is a master of discovering secrets, of creating deceptions, and of manipulating outcomes. So there is threat, there is power, and there is rationality. And these are sort of the main sort of political concepts that I want to think through in this seminar. The idea of a cunning enemy is something that is a little bit oddly absent from the history of Western political thought. It seems almost absurd to say that Western politics, political theory, even strategic and military theory has not been particularly concerned with cunning or with detection or deception. One thing I found in a review, years reviewing literature on intelligence and disinformation, information warfare, all the various terms, is that everyone who engages in a historiographical mode of writing, talking about origins, talking about canon, where do these ideas come from? What is their genealogy? What's their provenance? Almost everyone will write deception or intelligence in war or politics or what have you is as old as history itself, is as old as politics, is as old as humanity. Then there's usually some sort of vague gesture towards ancient Greek mythology, Homeric epics, the siege of Troy and the Trojan horse, the exploits of Odysseus, and the sort of cleverness of the gods, Zeus, Athena, Hermes, figures of sort of cunning and strategic rationality. Then the move is usually to go the Greeks, the contemporary, then of course the reference to Sun Tzu and to the Chinese tradition, which was contemporaneous, of course, in a much more formal mode, although we will do Sun Tzu next week in the seminar on the discourse, the sort of mid to late modern discourse of strategy. Then the next sort of obvious stepping stone in what is supposed to be the history or historiography of epistemic struggle is generally Machiavelli. The early modern, the birth of modernity, the emergence of scientific rationality, the first recognizable theorist of political science, and of course the infamous defender of the reason of state, the political rationality of advantage over all, the construction of politics around the model of an adversarial relationship between two actors, at least two actors, in a struggle for power, in which power is, of course, a limited good, a contested resource. So what's very curious is that outside of these few examples, there's almost nothing else. There is no historical book that you'll find on any politics, strategy, college, staff college syllabus on deception. There's nothing, there's no, we've got Clausewitz's on war. There's no on deception. There's no on intelligence. There's almost no theory of deception in international relations. There's very little, relatively speaking, theory within political theory of intelligence, detection. So what's interesting about, when we find ourselves, looking at a dominant discourse, the discourse of epistemic struggle, I think is arguably a dominant discourse, because it's now not only about the relationship between states, but also about domestic politics, is that there's this claim towards there's claims that justify or explain what's going on and why our approach is better and why we're good and they're enemies, rely on these historical warrants, these search for origins that justify it as a necessary outcome, as a timeless problem that can be solved by looking at timeless wisdom. But the actual historiography doesn't contain that timeless wisdom. So we know that we're looking at, we know that we've found a hidden element of an episteme. In Foucault's sense of the dominant discourse of knowledge around within which anything must be constructed if it is to be considered legible at all. So what I want to do in this seminar, now it was a long intro, but I think it was important to sort of really bring together the purpose and problem of the seminar and why this is reaching back into sort of ancient political mythology, is the discourse to which this, or the hidden discourse to which this epistemic struggle is sort of referring. It's not that it's not there, it's just that it's weirdly hidden. And I believe that we can detect the origins of epistemic struggle in a discourse of culture and politics that persisted from archaic Greece all the way through to early modernity. And it is the discourse of cunning intelligence. So the idea, now that's done, I was thinking that this could be a good moment to, before we go on, how's everyone doing? Is that, how long have we been running, Martina, actually now?
I think we've been going for 45 minutes because we started a bit late.
Right. Is
so I
that
think we can go a bit
45 minutes with being late or without being late?
with being late. It's been
Okay,
just
so
over
half
an hour.
Okay, no, that's what I wanted. Okay, good. So I was thinking, no, I've gone through everything, the significance of abduction, signs, inquiry. The reason I want to bring all these things together is I think Peirce's tools, Peirce's concepts, let us look at different historical periods, different ways of thinking about knowledge, different ways of constructing the relationship between power and knowledge and politics. And yet, because they deal not with the symbolic level, but with the underlying structure of how anything can be a sign or become a thought at all, the way that reality shapes our epistemic and our semiotic cognition, the theory of inquiry and his logic, so for Peirce, logic was what we think of as formal logic, epistemology, and semiotics. He saw them all as a broader, that was the larger field of logic. it lets us find continuities even between really significantly different historical periods and processes. And the point about this is not necessarily to go, here's a straight line from the beginning of history to now, and that's why everything happened, but to look at the kinds of discourses, concepts, ideas on which political thinkers of the present and strategists of the present are drawing. What do we think about epistemic struggle? Do we think it's legitimate? Do we think it's necessary? What do we think the consequences are? And in particular, what do we think the consequences might be for how we inquire in the world and how we form genuine communities of inquiry? So I think now is a really good time to move to the first presentation, if that is who was doing us. There was hang on, there's some things in the chat. Wait, like, should we do chat questions? I feel like if we go, I'm always so ambitious with my outline, and then I'm so slow in my actual delivery. Summarize Matt basically being along the lines of predicting. Yes, I think that's very much so. Cunning intelligence is a concept that can rationalize this spotty historiography of deception. I think the point is, okay, so I'll rather than make this a sort of detective mystery, I'll be more upfront. As we're going to see, cunning intelligence, cunning as a particular kind of embodied intelligence, but also as a particular kind of political rationality, a way of doing things, is primarily concerned with discovering hidden advantages, manipulating appearances, manipulating signs to create or exploit advantages. It's detection, it's deception, it's manipulation. And to that end, I think that it's very clear that if we think about what might be the epistemic or sort of cognitive ground, or if we wanted to naturalize cunning, I think looking at abduction is really, really the way, because we're going to see the typical skills, the typical problematics, difficulties, advantages of someone endowed with cunning intelligence. Very much, if we thought about someone who had their human abductive capacity amplified, in a sort of epic mythological way, what they would be able to achieve is very much the same thing as if they were a metic or sort of cunning figure. So I think that looking at the historical sort of discursive origins of epistemic struggle in the discourse of cunning lets us figure out what are the main kinds of epistemic and sort of semiotic operations that are important here, which is with the aim of being able to look for similar patterns in the present. So not only can we find that there are discourses that draw on historical ideas about cunning, but we find the same kinds of examples, the same kinds of problems, the same kinds of solutions, similar concepts being developed. So let's move on to the first presentation, which is the d'Etienne and Vernon book, chapter 1 and 2, from Cunning Intelligence in Ancient Greek Culture and Society. That seems like a good place to go, unless everyone is, and we'll do the presentation, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll move on to the rest. But if anyone has like a really important dramatic question that needs to be answered right now, then go ahead. Otherwise, who is doing the Reda? Yes.
Yes, hello Sam, hello everyone. I just want to go back to what you said about the history of Cunning.
Mhm.
So I think in my knowledge, I think it is somehow absent in the Western tradition, but I think it was really present at least as a word, as a title in other civilizations. If we take, for example,
Yeah.
the medieval reflection about politics in the Islamic world, so the Persian empires, the North African caliphates, the Middle Eastern. So if we take just, for example, before Machiavelli, we had Nizam al-Mulk Tosi with the Seljuki writer. He was a minister who wrote a kind of his prince for the king of the Seljukian empire. And if you remember this translation of a book by this the French translation of this book called something like le livre de la rue, so the book of Cunning in
Know
the
the one you mean. I know the one.
1970s.
Yeah. I know. I do know the one you mean. Yeah.
1970, c'est René Hawan, something like that.
Mm.
Yeah.
The Book of
So
Roosters, I think it's called. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and it was also present in the legal canon of the Islamic jurists. We find, for example, a book of canon in the Sharia in Islam. We also find it in the little stories, the short stories, and the what we call al-maqamat, probably in the Persian and Farsi tradition. I was thinking about this also to related to what Nagaristani, for example, said about this in his desert. So I think it stayed somehow present in this reflection of the desert, basically in the other side of the big actor, the major actors of international relations. So I think it was hidden, it stayed somehow. I don't know what you think about that, but I love to know. Thank you.
To give a quick answer now and then go into a bit after, absolutely. I think, look, anyone who's ever, engaged in any, okay, number one, yes, absolutely. There are, outside the Western tradition, there are long sort of canons of discourse in which trickery, intelligence, all the various modalities of cunning are present. And even in the West, where it has experienced a weird sort of suppressed history, these problems and ideas, these form the basis of all entertainment, right? So every adventure narrative, every heroic protagonist and figure, every drama is concerned with the discovery of surprises and the problems of deception. And I think what's really interesting is, of course, deceit and discovery are universal problems of any of conscious beings. And yet the instances in which these problems are brought into explicit discourse, so when they are made the object of inquiry, that is relatively seldom. That is what rarely happens. And even when we do find inquiry into epistemic struggle, the discovery and manipulation and exploitation of secrets, or deception, the manipulation of signs to block inquiry, there's very little theoretical work on this anywhere in any tradition. There's something about these phenomena that make them not only does deceptions resist our inquiries, since that's literally what any deception does, but the very concept itself seems to resist engagement, at least along the traditional epistemological lines. If we think about correspondence theory of truth, or constructive kind of personalist theories of truth, or if we think about common theories of communication, information, all these various sort of epistemic frameworks that we have, none of these really seem to capture what's going on with deception. At least that's the conclusion that I've arrived at. Scientific research into deception as a phenomena and trickery, various things, is a fairly recent event. And one might expect that, of course, politics is the world in which deceit and detection might be the most prevalent, the most relevant, a field of human activity in which those things might be inescapable. And yet it's political theory and political thought in which I find that they're most conspicuously absent. During the period in which it was very prominent in non sort of Occidental cultures, that's also a period where Christian norms and courtly norms sort of prevailed, and so there was certainly this hesitancy to let people even look at this stuff, because it was simply, no, we don't talk about that. We do it, but we might do it when it's necessary. We don't like to talk about it. So that was supposed to be my short answer. But yeah, I think that's and next week we will look at the Chinese tradition and the Western reception of the Chinese tradition, and I'm going to talk quite a lot about the role of sort of Orientalist frameworks in reading Sun Tzu and the creation of this sort of Western way of warfare, Western mode of strategy, and the Oriental mode of strategy. The Greeks, of course, love to see themselves as honest, open fighters, and the sort of Eastern Oriental Trojans as bow wielding deceivers. When of course all the Greek victories that occurred was through trickery and manipulation. So there's definitely a self-deception going on that was perhaps not so common in other cultures. So let's go on. Who is it, Martina? Are you going to jump in and pick out the lucky victim? I can't remember who it is.
I think the text that you want to be presented right now is the Cunning, Intelligent in Greek Culture and Society. Is that the one?
Yeah. We'll skip over the Barena and Nubiola because I sort of I'll bring that up at the end if we still have time. So let's jump into the Cunning.
Yeah, I have Arnab signed up. Do we have you here? Yes. Before you start, just a reminder that I'll give you, let's say, between 10 and 15 minutes for the presentation, and then we'll have to continue the class. So just so you know, to keep in mind as you present. Thank you so much.
Martina, actually, my presentation is not yet complete. So would it be a problem if I upload it?
That's fine. Or you can just start with what you have, and then Sam will jump in.
Do you want to just, maybe work from a long comment and then we can just go from there? We may as well. I'm curious just to sort of get your input now, and then, unless you really don't want to, in which case I can, of course, just launch into, I can talk about Cunning for hours. So.
That I would think could be better because I've just done 1/4 of it. So
that's okay. That's okay. Then just upload it when it's ready. Then I think Sam.
Sure.
I think
but maybe let's. Should we take a 5-minute break? I feel like we've been talking for a while. I lose all track of time. Like I'm into a totally timeless zone when I'm doing this, and my mouth just sort of works independently. So I have no sense of how long we're going or how long we've gone. So how are other people? Would people like a 5-minute break, or you'd rather just push through? If you want to push through, say something. If you just want to break, don't say anything, because then we can just go for it. Okay, break. 5 minutes?
Yeah, let's do 10,
7 minutes.
maybe.
10.
7.
All right. Yeah. 10, no, 10. Let's do 10. See you in 10.
All right.
Do you need to stop the recording, I guess?
Sam, should we have the other presentations?
Yeah, I think that's actually probably the best way to go about it, is to do the other presentations now on the Kairos text and cunning intelligence and sort of Machiavellian political theory. And then after that, I will sort of then go through the genealogy of Cunning a bit more explicitly. One thing, just to quickly make some sort of a quick review of the other 2 readings. So this was sort of the third reading. that we're going to have the presentations for now, but in the one from Barrena and Nubiola, I set that because I wanted to sort of draw out the role of abduction, not only in inquiry, but in cognition more broadly, and show that abduction is sort of the engine of discovery, the engine of creativity. It is making connections that people have not made before, of discovering affordances and advantages and potentials in things. And I think part of what I find very interesting in the discourse of epistemic struggle is that on the one hand, there's this very strong opposition between the rational and the irrational, between the true and the mere appearance, and yet the logic of abduction and the practice and the conduct of abduction is necessary both for discovery and for deception. So as much as the history of Western philosophical and scientific thought has tried to exclude cunning, to exclude hypothesis, abduction, Popper famously said that the logic of discovery was irrational and was a matter for psychology. Peirce would have thought that that was absurd. So abduction is necessary for inquiry, and yet is the essential enabling condition for also adversarial creativity, we might say. And then I chose the reading from Détienne and Vernon because that deals both with ancient with Homeric epic and with Hesiod, as well as with classical Greek thought. So, and then I wanted to draw that through to the early modern, the Renaissance, and Machiavelli and his contemporaries across Europe, and the way they revived the ancient discourse of cunning, not always explicitly, but in their choice of problematic, their choice of concepts, and the solutions they found to the political and epistemological problems of the day. I think we'll see that the idea of cunning played a very significant role in how not only antique but early modern thinkers thought about what we might call epistemic struggle. There's a comment from Sensa, which is really important, about Carl Schmitt as a sort of theorist of cunning, and I absolutely agree that he deals with the problem and the sort of logic of cunning and its potential consequences for politics. I wouldn't say he goes into it explicitly. I don't think he explicitly theorizes cunning as such, but he's one of the few thinkers, I think, who did engage very consequentially with problems of discovery and deception within adversarial relationships. But I want to go through that, I think, towards the end of the next seminar. But nonetheless, if that's relevant to the presentation and to the discussion of Machiavelli political theory, by all means, let's go into it now, because if that's the way it goes, that's the way it needs to be. So that's enough from me. Presentations.
So for the Machiavelli text, I've got signed up censor and suspended reason. Whoever wants to go first, or I'm not sure whether you guys prepared a text together, maybe.
We didn't. Hello, can you hear me properly?
Yes.
If suspended reason, love your name, wishes to go first, it's okay. I did an intertextual overview of the work by Kairos on Metis in Machiavellian political thought, along with other authors. So if the other person prepared an exclusive presentation on the text as such, I think it will be good to review that and then proceed with my presentation.
Yeah, so I didn't, I mean, there are obviously connections to the other texts that will come up, but I focused on this text. So I'm happy to go first, if that's how you want to do it.
Yes.
All right. Lovely. All right. So I kind of just jotted down some notes as I went and tried to make connections between other things I knew and bring up points of tension and connections with other texts that we've been reading. So in this text, I mean, I'm going to basically assume that everyone's read this text since that was the assignment. So I won't give a summary, but I'll walk through the points. So, the first kind of thing, and the structuring idea here, which also gets brought up in Cunning Intelligence in Greek Culture and Society, is this metaphor of the fox as being analogous to Cunning in Machiavelli and to concepts of Metis. And some of the kind of core characteristics of the fox and of Metis and of Cunning, this idea of a polymorphic intellect. And I think in the Cunning Intelligence in Greek Culture, this gets kind of compared to Puikilos, this idea of the fox as having a many-colored skin. So he has this kind of adaptive, shifting, protean aspect. And he's also, of course, compared to Odysseus. I think in both texts, this idea that Odysseus is fox-like or has this kind of Metis comes up. And I don't remember whether it explicitly gets brought up in our text, but I think the leading way that Odysseus is introduced in the Odyssey is as polytropos, as a man of many turns, and this gets translated in a lot of different ways. I think some translators have thought of that he kind of has this winding, meandering journey home, but also that he is a person of many guises who is constantly adapting to a situation, and he will change his name, he'll change his guise, he will pretend to be a sheep to escape the Cyclops lair, and he will say that he is nobody in order to not have basically his reputation tarnished. If I recall correctly, that he says he's nobody, and this prevents the complaint of Polyphemus to his father Poseidon from retribution against Odysseus, because Poseidon says, "Who did this to you?" And his son Polyphemus, the Cyclops, says, "Nobody did this to me." So foxes are, according to these texts, they're pretenders, they're dissemblers, they're unpredictable, they can recognize artifice and snares. They are flexible, they have foresight, they are attentive and watchful, they are alert, and they are experienced. And I want to kind of focus on foresight because we've talked a lot about the idea of prediction, why prediction, maybe taking for granted that prediction is an important part of these kinds of game playing, that whether they're geopolitical, whether they're about intelligence, that we're playing these games and they require foresight, whether they're adversarial and cooperative. And I think this is one of the interesting things about foresight to me, is that in kind of my research on these topics, it seems like foresight is not something that's uniquely useful or relevant to adversarial games, that it's just as much important in cooperative games in which both players are trying to mutually kind of predict one another. And you can imagine, like, a classic example of a cooperative game is you're driving down the street. And of course, you want to make yourself as legible and predictable to the other driver as possible so that you don't get to a crash. And so you're engaged in a project of mutual legibility because you both have deeply aligned interests. But when you are in a kind of adversarial game, then this changes. You don't have quite as much alignment of interests. And so as a result, rather than kind of converging your horizons of expectations to kind of some shared set of selling points or cooperative procedures and habits and routines, you instead have this kind of divergent thing where every time I predict you, you kind of wriggle away and try to be different so that on the next round, I can't get you again. And the classic example of this, I think, is probably like rock, paper, scissors. And so there's kind of, this idea, this protean adaptive, I think at one point in the text, they talk about you must have as many guises as your enemy has guises, or there's this way in which if your enemy takes many shapes, you must have as many shapes to match him or more. There's this idea of matched flexibility and adaptivity, which I think is best summed up with the Proteus metaphor, though reading these texts was the first time I learned that I guess this comes up over and over in Greek mythology with the rape of Thetis and elsewhere. I think Hermes also is the shapeshifter, right, at one point. And so one thought I had here in evolutionary studies, there's a concept called the fitness landscape. And it's a little hard to describe, but you can basically kind of picture a landscape in hills and valleys three-dimensionally. And on the y-axis is your fitness. It's basically how well adapted you are to your environment and how likely you are to survive through rounds of the game being life. And on the x-axis is something like the possible configurations that you can take in response to your environment. And the idea is that traditionally in evolutionary theory, there's been this idea of a semi-static landscape, that you want to kind of be at the top of a hill, you want to find a local optimum or maximum and settle upon that point. But more recently, these studies have actually been trying to change the conceptual metaphor and say, actually, we're in a fitness seascape, that it's more like these constantly changing, shifting waves. And so therefore, you can't just find a point and settle and say, this is the optimum, I'm on it, I'm at the top of the hill. You're constantly having to change to track the changing waves. And this obviously fits nicely with the fact that Metis is the daughter of the ocean, that Thetis is a sea nymph, that Proteus is a river god, right? There is this kind of recurring metaphor, I think, in Western conceptual structure, where the sea is something that's always shifting. It's about fluidity and flux. You have Heraclitus and the kind of pre-Socratics. And then versus land, which is very stable. And so I think this kind of brings us to two kinds of the problems of induction. And Sam brought up Popper earlier. And Popper, kind of like Hume, has this cynicism about our inability to make perfect inferences or perfect induction. And I think, this, and Hume's kind of classic example is, just because the sun has come up for the last 4 billion years doesn't mean we can know the sun is going to come up tomorrow. And this is true. I mean, this is kind of one of those gotcha technicalities where we say, okay, we can't really know, but like we can basically know. But this is very different from the problem of induction in adversarial games. So us having a theory of the sun, that the sun will rise tomorrow, will not change the sun's behavior. The environment is this kind of neutral force that is indifferent to our theorizing and adaptation to that environment. And this is very different from an agent who will actually adapt to our theories of it and our behaviors towards it. And I think this kind of is really maybe the core. When we were talking last week about science versus intelligence, the author made this kind of distinction about how science differs from intelligence. And to me, at least my personal theory, is that really this is about reflexivity. The science typically, traditionally studies non-reflexive areas. And yes, areas like sociology and psychology have tried to claim the mantle of being sciences, but they are dealing with such a slippery reflexive terrain in which every time they theorize, the theorized object changes in response. And when you have these adversarial games, this I think really maxes out. One kind of metaphor that I really like for this comes from the movie The Princess Bride. It's in some gaming communities called Wine in Front of Me, or Wi-Fom. And it's the kind of this classic shuffling around, or like rock, paper, scissors. There are there's 2 cups. Which one is poison? Is it the one in front of me, the one in front of you? And you're trying to basically stay one step ahead of your opponent. It's kind of this prediction game. All right, so that's kind of the foxiness and the kind of protean nature. Let's see. So then, there's kind of the paper talks about prudence also being very important to Metis and concepts of Metis. I kind of read this prudence, at least as they're using it, as sort of economy, almost a subtlety, because this is Machiavelli and we're kind of in the realm of Italian discourse. I couldn't help but think of sprezzatura and this kind of idea of a kind of effortlessness, and the idea of expertise as a sort of minimal force. And so why would you expend unnecessary energy? And also that subtlety is something, it's a kind of concealed gesture. It doesn't, because there's not an excess of effort, it also doesn't necessarily betray the hand of what it's up to. Let's see. So then it kind of talks about betrayal and dissimulation as an important part of Metis. And I think this starts getting into the stuff about bellicose cunning rationality as a style of Metis. And I think, to me, the important intervention here is that honesty and fidelity, or faithfulness, loyalty, not betraying your word, should be considered instrumental rather than terminal values. And so I think at points this paper kind of seemed to say, well, it's been a long time since I've actually read The Prince proper, so I forget what Machiavelli himself says about this, but the paper almost implies that betrayal and dishonesty is an important part of being a good strategist. And I think perhaps I'm projecting onto this text, but I took some issue with this because, for one, you can only betray your word if somebody accepts your word in the first place. That is, you have to have enough reputation built up through a long history of honesty and a long history of committing to your word and then following up on your word and basically becoming reliable for people to actually take your word at all. And so betrayal itself is premised on a history of honesty, such that there's almost a false distinction where you say, well, the prince has to be ready to be unfaithful or dishonest. He, in fact, has to be both, and there's some way in which this dichotomy is false. I guess the last thing I'll kind of say, I think this maybe comes from Cunning Intelligence in Greek Culture and Society, but this idea of the fox having seven entrances or exits to his lair, that he has more tricks and then therefore kind of spreads his adversary thin, that you don't know how to catch him because he can take so many different possible routes, is really related to a concept that I've come across in machine learning theory and AI, which is often called commitment versus empowerment, or else optimization versus empowerment. And the idea here is that, well, perhaps you can imagine two kind of lines. Perhaps this is World War I kind of trench warfare might be a good example here. You have two lines of combatants separated by no man's land. And of course, there will be an attack. And if you know where in your 100-mile long line defensively the attack is going to be, you can concentrate your forces. And so this is commitment. You are committing to a kind of course of defense because you're anticipating where the enemy will attack you. And the opposition to this is empowerment. And so empowerment would be keeping your entire line kind of evenly distributed. And you say, in the face of uncertainty, I have no idea where they're going to come for me. And so commitment is kind of what you do. The more certain you are, the more you commit yourself, and the less certain you are, the more ambiguous your information is, the more you stay empowered. Another way of kind of understanding this, perhaps imagine that you're kind of standing in a circle, and the goal of the game is to hit a ball out of the circle that could come flying at you from any direction. Perhaps, with a racket or something. If you have no idea where the ball is going to come from, you're going to stay exactly in the circle. And if you have a sense of where it comes from, if you know it's going to come from the left, you're going to go to the left. And so I think a lot of these games are really about creating a false sense of certainty in your opponent such that they commit themselves. Because once they commit themselves, once they concentrate all their forces at one point in a defensive line, it means all their other points are weak. They are exploitable. One word I've kind of seen used to describe this is that you're in fact subsidizing other strategies. And so this is, I think, one way in which these ideas of camouflage and trickery kind of play out in adversarial games. And that's pretty much what I've got.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That was really good. Let's just move straight on. This is gonna be great. Okay, thank you so much, Suspended Reason and Sensor.
Yes,
Take it away.
of course. I did a presentation as such. Let me see if I can share it. Oh, thank you to Suspended Reason for his presentation. Actually, that's quite nice to what I'm about to show. Okay. Do I sound okay? Is my volume okay? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. It's all just black so far, but yes, we see the presentation now. So I think if you go into presentation mode, you should be able to share just that.
Share.
I think it's possible that if you click slideshow, then it might just go into the presentation.
Yeah. I'm aware it's just that I cannot see the top bar where I can put the slideshow because of the...
Okay, go up.
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit dumb with these things.
All
How
good.
about it?
Yeah,
It's rocking? Okay.
Yes, it is. Okay, we can see it. Thank you so much. You can start.
Of course. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to whomever may correspond. I will do this small intertextual overview of Kairos, Machiavellian Metis, and Wilhelm Reich's fascism mass psychology. First of all, most of the topics brought in by Kairos in this paper have already been dealt by Suspended Reason's presentation. I will dwell more into them along with the lines of what Wilhelm Reich discusses on how Cunning plays a role on the constitution of the mass psychology of fascism. The main idea explored by Kairos refers to the relevance of Metis, or cunning rationality, as she calls it from the very beginning, within Machiavelli's political thinking, its entanglement with pre-classic and modern institutions, most in relation to the examples coming from Greek philosophy, for example, drawn from the Trojan Horse, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. And the lines which can be drawn between such entanglement and the execution of contemporary political powers based on successive leaderships and institutional self-preservation. As the first point, we need to describe what do I mean here by successive leaderships, which in a pragmatical sense, it's mostly defined by forms of governance or sovereign powers in the line of oligarchies, monarchies, and theocracies. What do we mean by institutional self-preservation inside of successive leaderships? It's that we mean that they are searching for a teleological quest of political power based on winning and preserving such power, which is not concerned with the idea of uncertainty and unpredictability upon near or long-term future. So we could say that it's rather an expression of entanglements upon teleological quest, not thanatropical ones. The biggest example of thanatropical quest and cunning intelligence is posited on revolutionary aspects. For example, in order to do this intertextual overview, we will need to define what do we mean by Metis, what is not Metis, why is Metis important in Machiavelli's political thinking, and why is Metis important in Wilhelm Reit's psychology? And obviously, how do this perspective on Metis intertwine? When we talk about Metis, it's also curious to point out that it's a mythical figure, some sort of godlike figure posited from some Greek mythological traditions upon the figure of perfidy. Perfidy being the way in which treachery mostly manifests on contexts like war. First, we have point 1b. As you can remember, it was what is Metis? And basically Kairos has posited its cunning rationality. It's a practical knowledge which allows a political agent to confront unpredictability without overcoming it definitely. We go back to the lion-fox analogy in the sense that it mostly shows that leadership and its relation within political thinking focused on determinacy. It's mostly what the figure of the princess entails. Much has been said about the relationship between prudence and astuteness, for example, with the figure of the polymorphic fox. But the lion, it's also the representative of the straight up strong figure in sovereign power, which once again, it's deeply important because that's the figure of the prince. Metis passively contains persuasiveness, astuteness, sagacy, prudence, political rationality, and tactical thinking. Tactical put has a difference from strategic specifically. Metis actively contains violence, perfidy, treachery, adversarial annihilation, and strategic thinking, which is the thinking of the strong ones. This distinction between active and passive makes a reference to the way in which political cunning and cunning rationality has a role in public and private spheres. This does not mean that Metis is functional within one another, but it's present in both of them, but operates in different modes regarding which sphere are we talking about. Metis thrives when the mediation of its weak, which is to say passive, and strong, which is to say active dimensions, occurs through prudence in favor of positively dwelling with fortune. With fortune, understand here, has the mythical figure of uncertainty and unpredictability in favor of the prince's power and its own preservation. There was a quote, which I'm gonna read briefly, taken from Machiavelli's on the analogy of the fortune and what the sovereign, the prince, has to do with it, through whether it be or not through cunning. And that is to say that when we think about Fortuna, Fortuna represents the uncertainty, inconsistency, and unpredictability in the struggle for power. Fortuna for Machiavelli is not something that only needs to be taken into power or try to be controlled. It must be subsumed, dominated, and backed upon. He says that it's a curious analogy to say fortune is a woman and then say we have to subsume such a woman. I think it's pretty Machiavelli. Metis perishes whether it be in or after war, making reference of talking about in when we mean active bellicose stances of Cunning, and after war when we talk about passive or domestic stances on war and Cunning, where the particular desire of the sovereign power figure pursues victory over its adversary at any cost. Once again, the limits of Cunning are resembled in this idea of the adversarial annihilation or its complete obliteration. Once again, fortune is a woman which needs to be subsumed. Setting its own limit upon wanting to set its own people and quote unquote fortune below such self-preservation stances. The author posits that even Machiavelli emphasizes that the importance of Cunning is that it reflects the limits of political power through sovereign activities. And the biggest limit this posits, whether it be through revolutionary means or not, or through totalitarianist means or not, is the hubris of violence, the impliance of total war, or what other authors like Hannah Arendt have called the banality of evil. The point, what is not Metis, Cunning rationality also sets its own limits, not only by Kairos' overviews of Machiavelli's political thinking about Metis has insufficient upon the threats of adversarial annihilation, or the nefarious attempt in subjugating uncertainty. Wilhelm Reich's seminal work, Mass Psychology of Fascism, originally posted in 1933, the version I used is one from 1946, seeks to outline certain ways in which pervasive thought, other ways of talking about Metis or Cunning rationality, gets circumvented among totalitarian expressions of political power. From this frame of reference, we can say that persuasive thinking, aka Metis, is not institutional thinking in the sense Cunning impedes institutional prevalence by not allowing to develop domestic, which is to say massive dimensions of power. The biggest example is the way in which succession-based political figures need to propose as the biggest threat, the one which can be overcome. We are gonna win, not negotiate with the enemy. We can see later on that this is brought up by Wilhelm Reich in its analysis of fascism. Strategic thinking, it's also not Cunning rationality in the sense it does not seek for historical transformation upon institutional power, but rather winning and preserving it. Once again, Metis works under the logic of hegemony and not revolution. If we understand revolution not as a status state of co-living, it's rather an emergency state of the society, equivalent to war or terrorism, where the inquiry is based upon persuasiveness. And the last thing that Metis is not is scientific thought, in the sense adversarial annihilation, even taking a reference to the Peirce scheme of thought that we have mentioned, based upon inquiry. It's contrary to inquiry-driven epistemological frameworks and modes of thinking. Once again, the epistemic struggle we have been mentioning. The main points mentioned by Regina Kairos in its work regarding Cunning deal with the prevalence of traditional powers and institutions, allocates Cunning rationality within a tradition of political thinking traced from pre-classical times onto more historical landscapes. Hence, the examples of Greek mythology linked with Machiavelli's political thinking, and also delineates the limits for an effective, pervasive political rationality and its main limits of indeterminacy. For example, the way in which the hubris of violence entails the limit of Cunning rationality when fully launched. taking the example of the works by Reich upon the presence of cunning in political landscapes, it deals with the effective prevalence of succession-driven political power and institutions through the alliteration of concepts entailed by Metis onto the concept of ideology has material power. Allocates the transfiguration of cunning rationality in both domestic and bellicose societal states through historical examples rather than mythical ones. This is like a genealogical effort intertwining Metis and fascism has persuasive modes of thinking in history. Why historical examples and not mythical ones? Because Wilhelm Reich talks specifically about the uprising of National Socialism on top of the socialist regime proposited by the Russian Revolution. And third, it posits how this stance on ideology has material power sustains most of the principles of totalitarian expressions of populist cunning practices like Nazism, whose strength relies on a characteriological structure of mass society and the social effects of mysticism. Once again, the idea of the charismatical leader also revives this idea of the importance of cunning in the public and private sphere. Finishing up, we have three main points of intertwining and interjection between the two authors, which is a consonant views on persuasion has a political rationality conformed by private and public dimensions, both correspondingly passive and active, which can effectively operate at domestic, which is to say peaceful, to say it in a way, and bellicose, which is to say warlike levels. There are also common concerns on the way power is held through elective and selective processes through institutional legitimacy, whether it be the presence of cunning through populist revolutionary movements or the process of cunning in the preservation of traditional states like oligarchs or theocracies. They both found a common limit on unbound expressions of active violence, which is to say of states of emergency and states of peace. Finally, I wanted to add this small quote by Genesis P. Aldrich, where she talks about how persuasion can deal through more esoteric scenarios. And it's interesting because it's the idea of there's a little bit here, there's a little bit there, a certain way, and a way too much. But when you've done it all, it's too late to care because I've already persuaded you, like always. Those are the things that I've thought and dealt with while doing this presentation. And thank you for listening to me. I will stop sharing now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Senza. That was super interesting. Those are two really good presentations. Senza, I think you can run the class now since you've got more slides than me.
Lol.
That was,
LOL.
that was great. Apologies also on that. I'm not a slide person and I never have been, and I don't think I ever will be. But you've all got stunningly powerful and highly abductive imaginations that will allow you to visualize every important piece of information that I'm giving you.
I did have a question, actually, based upon.
Go ahead. This might be a good. What do we got? We got.
Yeah.
10:30. I was a bit late, and I'm sorry for that. Do people have the capacity to go 15 minutes over time to make up for that? Do people have to leave? How's that looking? Anyone object to going 15 minutes over time?
I'm dying for it. It's Friday.
You have to leave. All right. Well, that of course I'll make sure that I don't say anything like really interesting after you leave. So, and no one else is allowed to either. All right. So let's do a bit of Q&A. I want to finish off with a sort of to continue basically to sort of fill in the presentation on the d'Etienne and Vernon text. And I want to tie together the cunning, power, and abduction specifically, and think about them in terms of the broader problem and topic of the seminar, which is struggles over knowledge in international politics. So let's do a little bit of Q&A. Also, feel free to respond to the presentations or my first lecture or Sensei, if you can formulate your question briefly, since you jumped in first there, then let's get a few on the board and then we can work from there.
Yeah, of course. It's quite brief, actually. I was thinking about what you were just mentioning about what Rada at, in the sense that in apparent terms, we could maybe get to say or conclude that there haven't been any sort of in-depth explorations or critical approaches to cunning intelligence, at least in the West, and how Rada put that must be, on a wide scale, defect from the West rather than political history itself. Since, for example, the idea of cunning, it's not only based on pre-classical or pre-modern, to say in a way, institutions like the mythological ones, whether there are the Greek ones or the Nordic ones. For example, Loki is the god of deceit, of treachery, of astuteness. He's also the fox. And it comes from a deeply westernized tradition, right? I was thinking that, well, if we think on Cunning or Metis has a logic which can operate under and after war, has active, which is to say bellicose, or passive, which is to say domestic stances, we can see that is not something which happens at a public or a private sphere, like either or. It happens in both of them. Nonetheless, it manages to have a rupture within the society it reproduces, when what it looks is to operate from the idea of adversarial annihilation, the idea of obliterating completely your enemy. And I was thinking that beyond this theoretical approach to how this rupture can occur, one can see that there are not only intellectual but actually existent efforts driven on having this idea of discursive obliteration, at least, of the adversary. I've noticed this, for example, in the works of Murray Rothbard, to put it in a sense. Or another big example is the way in which most oligarchic presidents in South America or Latin America are operating at the moment, like Javier Milei declaring war to all of those lefties or leftoids, and that they're gonna crawl under their beds, or the idea of Nayib Bukele. Once again, these oligarchic figures, which represent the sovereign, once again, falling onto the fallacy of cunningly lead a nation. I was wondering if we can say, in fact, that Millet or Rothbard or these minarchist efforts or intellectual efforts upon global and capitalistic economy can be taken as actually existing examples of cunning rationality within the political landscape. Or Trump, I don't know.
Perfect. Nice. Okay. Nave.
Hi, yeah, listen, thanks for those presentations. They were really fantastic. I am just looping back a little bit. I'm wondering, when you were talking earlier on about abductive reasoning, and I noticed in the text that you assigned us on Peirce, where he sort of says that, I'm wondering, is abductive reasoning adversarial in itself? And actually, I don't think it is. And I'm wondering about the kind of connection between those two things, because what Peirce says is that working with doubt is not about will. And he kind of makes a comment about Cartesian doubt. And it's about, he says, to quote, the phenomenon of surprise has no relation to Cartesian doubt, which for Peirce is mere paper doubt. Genuine doubt always has an external origin and cannot be produced as an act of will. So I'm just kind of wondering, setting up the adversarial might be very much about the ego, and the Cartesian ego. That's just one thing I'm wondering. The other thing is, and maybe this ties into that as well, thinking about the epistemological foundation, I am wondering, if there's a management of the adversarial state that we might think with Hobbes about that. as an early modern thinker, you know, the kind of quintessential anti-liberal, liberal thinker. It might be very helpful for us to think about, you know, challenges of neoliberal times, where the sovereign authoritarian state necessarily mediates in the state of nature, or the war of all against all. So what Hobbes is doing is saying, you know, that actually the state of nature is one that is, you know, naturalizing that adversarial condition. Now, what that does is that the state, you know, morally legitimizes its violence in its instantiation of its own legislative mechanism, and it covers over that violence, and it legitimizes then the violence necessary to enforce that law. So in other words, there is a recoding, you know, an encoding of violence with morality, and that's going to be kind of carried through in new adversarial encounters, where perhaps there may have been a sort of a cunning, you know, in the state of nature, but that now is encoded now to become deception. So I'm just wondering if that kind of yeah, it works in there with what you're talking about. Has anything to contribute or add?
Great, great comment and question. Thank you so much. These are all really interesting. Anyone else? Three's, of course, the holy Persian number. So if anyone wants to jump in again, otherwise this could be a good place to leave off. Anybody? What about in the chat? I don't see any explicit questions. There's a good discussion going on there, though. Okay. All right. Maybe everyone take a moment, you know, drink your water, more than you think you need, and we'll just come back in a few minutes. Like 1 or 2, I'm talking here. Not a real break, but just a quick break. Actually, no, that's a good moment. I need to use the bathroom. So let's come back in 2-3 minutes, as quick as possible. Is that all right? All right, thanks. Okay. All right, this is a great place to kick off again and move to the kind of end of this session. Thank you everyone for your contributions, presenters and question askers. I really feel like everyone kind of encountered exactly the problems that I was hoping, and I don't mean having problems, but rather the problematics that I was hoping people would face, which is how to think about the role of abductive and semiotic practice in politics, whether it's something that can be rationalized, whether it's something that remains lost in the world of practice, whether it's something that about which scientific knowledge can be generated, or whether traditional mythic knowledge is sufficient to understand what's going on, to think about how abductive orientations towards complex, changing, strategic, adversarial environments have consequences for the application and use of power. These are all exactly the things that I was hoping that we'd get to. So thank you so much. To try and treat the aspects of the questions that I think I can answer, or at least that I could contribute to answering. So I've got, between the presentations and the questions, I've got so many notes out that I've easily to lose my place. Since your point about authoritarian styles of governance and statecraft, so the application of power through sort of various instruments, and the way that this bellicose version of Metis, because I think to address also in a way Neve's comment about whether abduction or cunning, and then Senzo's question about cunning, whether these are necessarily bellicose or whether they're necessarily adversarial. I think as I will go through, when we look at the broader semantic field of Metis, we'll find that it is oddly neutral. Not in the sense that it isn't going to offend or upset anybody, but that it doesn't mind who it upsets or offends. Cunning is exactly the ability not to win within the rules, but to change what the rules are, to play with the rules. The absolute most emblematic image or diagram of cunning is the reversal, the sudden redistribution of power relationships that were thought to be stable. So I think that the bellicose form of Metis, the aspect of cunning that is oriented specifically towards what we might call zero-sum games, where there is no collaborative or collective victory, there is no collective cooperative convergence, but rather a competition over completely exclusive and scarce resources. Whether these, I think the cunning of authoritarian regimes and any regimes that employ the particular kinds of deceptions that authoritarian regimes do, because for instance, liberal regimes deceive, trick, manipulate, but they do so generally under the presumption that they have to maintain and preserve their reputation for honesty. And the populists of the present use what a lot of people call bullshit. To use a technical term, bullshit being lies that are told openly, not so much in order to propagate an untruth, but to destroy the truth norm, to undermine the very ideas of whether truth matters, whether it can be achieved, and to be able to create a sort of situation of absolute ambiguity in which then the true deception, the hidden intent to annihilate one's enemies, can be hidden behind ambiguity. Oh, we're just joking. Oh, it's just a joke. Oh, it's ambiguous what he means. People always make that hand gesture when they're excited and on stage. You know, oh, he didn't really mean that. He meant this. The authoritarian speakers of the present are sort of masters of this sophistic bullshit. It is sophistry in the classical sense. In English, you have this interesting distinction in the sort of discourse on cunning that does exist. We have a term, low cunning. So there's the cunning of a real genius, and then there's something you call low cunning. And low cunning is like the cunning of the petty criminal, the cunning of the mere tactician. Low cunning is the cunning of someone who can, carry out some clever stratagem, but isn't capable of linking it to anything more broadly. Short-term gains that appear very clever and effective, and that will ultimately end up undermining the entire enterprise. I think low cunning is how I would describe that mode. And I think it's because authoritarian regimes lack whatever it is that would allow them to reach high cunning. This is speaking very abstractly, by the way. And we can think about what constitutes high cunning, which is why they tend to reach for the tools of violence. So in the origin myth, we have, Zeus in his war against the Titans and his attempt to displace Kronos. The main sort of sources of power are these two figures, Kratos and Bia, force and domination, violence and hegemony, we might sort of see them as. And without them, without their help, he couldn't have won. But when Zeus swallows Metis, when he incorporates her foresight, and this Foreknowledge is the ability both to anticipate but also to deceive, because to deceive, I have to not only carry out my own inquiry, but I have to know how you inquire in order to manipulate that. It's when Zeus incorporates Metis, that's when his power and his sovereignty is made permanent and universal. Because from then on, I think the phrase is, there's no cunning plan can be brought against him that has not already passed through his own mind. So there's this, within the mythic sort of discourse, high cunning can achieve power and hegemony without, not completely without, but without having to constantly reach for violence and domination. It can do it purely through art, artifice, trickery, and then low cunning uses deception and detection merely to increase the efficacy of violence, right? This is the military domain, where intelligence and deception are not ends in themselves, but are what's called force multipliers. They allow you to increase the leverage of your activity. The lever being a classic mechanical figure of the relationships of cunning. Efficient, surprising, achieving things impossible in nature through clever application of mediating instruments. So I think authoritarians are reach for cunning and do it badly. And it's interesting to think about how and why. And I think it's because they underestimate the degree to which cunning actually links to detection, to discovery, to inquiry, that perhaps there is a way to be cunning without cruelty. Neve, your comment about whether abduction is itself adversarial. No, I agree completely. I don't think it is. I think the reason I link them is because, number one, adversarial relationships, and this comes back to Suspended Reason's presentation and the really interesting points about the way that environmental conditions shape whether actors will pursue cunning strategies or cultivate cunning competencies. There are certain kinds of environments. If we look, if you look at the broad semantic field of Metis, not only the mythology, but then also cultural elements, cunning figures are those people who have to engage with changing, shifting, uncertain, ambiguous environments. People who want to turn one thing into some other thing. People who want to take some given power dynamic and find a way to reverse it with a minimum of effort. And so these are within, sort of narratological analysis, adventures, epics, survivals, wars, diplomatic ventures, spying, all the various kind of, they're all adversarial relationships. And I think what's interesting about, and this is Vernon d'Etienne make this point, which is that as a modality of sort of thinking, cunning is a way, it works by treating the world like an adversary. Cunning approaches things adversarially. And I think, so my point is that abduction is necessary for adversarial relationships because the fact of a real or a presumed adversary means that there are constraints on knowledge, there are constraints on information, there is a constraint on time, there is a constraint on potential action. Adversarial contexts, and this goes back to the Origo paper from last week on the adversarial epistemology and what brings people to adopt the adversarial epistemology, which makes advantage the highest goal of inquiry over truth. And that is the presence and the threat of the adversary. So the adversarial environment. So abduction is on the one hand simply the only thing that is available to people in adversarial environments. And of course, adversariality, we could potentially make it adverse environments. We could think of any, if we look at other figures from Greek mythology and culture who are emblematic of cunning or this kind of abductive competency, either at discovering secrets, creating illusions, or clever manipulations, these are people who face adverse situations, materials that resist unlikely combinations of things. There's a paper, I think I put it on the additional reading perhaps of this week, by a friend of mine called Benedict Singleton. Ben wrote a really interesting PhD a long time ago about Metis as the logic of design. And he has this really nice formulation of cunning as the ability to elicit surprising results from unpromising materials. And of course, if you want to do that, abduction's the only way. It is the only way to generate genuinely new thought, to discover the causes and meanings of genuine surprises. So that's also why in the discourse of Cunning, we find that one of the most, and this is relates to the idea of the what would I say, multiplication of force, so force multipliers, the leverage, violence and other kinds of actions are massively enabled, for instance, by surprise. So if I'm an adversarial detective, I can minimize the potential harms that will come from surprise attacks by pursuing, the activities of intelligence. And if I wish to maximize the potential of my surprise attacks, I will use deception. And in both those cases, I both have to rely on and exploit the operations of abduction. So any adversary who has a limited potential to inquire into their, into their opposite, into their other, has to make, many of their most important decisions based on premises that are mere conjecture, that are only abductions. On the other hand, they also then, in deceiving the other, need to understand what their targets' abductions are, what their habits of inquiry are, and then intervene in such a way as to manipulate the hypotheses that the adversary uses to make their own plans. And here we end up at the longtime CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton called, although he lifted it from T.S. Eliot, the wilderness of mirrors. What if I know that they know, but they know that I know, but if they know that I know, then I will think the other thing, but then they'll think, this sort of endless recursive game that the game theorists sort of drove themselves a bit mad with. Somewhere in the reading is a paper by Paul Thagard, philosopher of science. It's an early paper of his, but it's really interesting on adversarial problem solving. That gets really into these issues of sort of course, the essence of strategy is not a plan, right? A strategy is a logic of action based on a situation, based on an adversarial situation in which the object of reasoning will change their habits based on your actions, right? If the situation can't change either unpredictably or based on what I do, strategy is not involved. So abduction, I think, has real potential to be instrumentalized within adversarial context, but I also just think that it's the form of reasoning, or it's the mode of rationality that's just most sort of native to adversarial scenarios, but also to creative scenarios and to scientific scenarios. And I think this is, abduction is what happens when we're at the limit of what we know, and when we're sort of struggling to find things despite adverse circumstances. I think that's about all I want to go through for now. How much time we got left? We've got a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to close out now, move towards the end. The first myth of cunning intelligence that we have is, of course, in Hesiod. And, sorry, we've got questions. Let's go to those a little bit at the end. I'm going to just do a quick summary, and then I've lost my mouse. And then that's is that okay, or are they very quick questions? No one has a very quick question though.
Those don't exist.
Go on, Reda, go on.
Yeah, I I was wondering about your conception of epistemic struggle, and my question is it exclusive to major state actors? Because I was thinking about those non-state actors, like they also have a specific definition of what we call today strategic planning. So, and if I understand your definition of the epistemic struggle, it gives this epistemology framework to strategic planning. So, so by definition, the agents of intelligence, think tanks, of officials of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, etc. So work to weaponize and securitize information. And I was thinking that those non-state actors, they also did that. So we find like the example of some post-Sayyid Qutb strategists and tacticians who theorized the jihad in the Middle East. For example, the hidden obligation of Muhammad Farag. We can see somehow what's happening in Syria with Julani. It's not chaotic. There is some rationality in it. So there is this adversarial thinking. And that's my question.
And then there was one other very quick question, wasn't it? I remember that you were going to ask it very
Yes.
quickly. I got the distinct sense it was going to be super quick.
Yes, Sam. Actually, I just had a quick observation. You mentioned about the changing polymorphic landscapes of surprise, and also you mentioned the idea of Metis being a sort of adaptability to that that changing landscape. So I was thinking of it just reminded me that in the Indian epic Mahabharata, we see a sort of the palace of illusions in which the the uh, the Pandavas, the five brothers were residing in Indraprastha, in their kingdom Indraprastha, the uh, the palace of illusions. The Kauravas, the opponents, actually find it very difficult to adapt themselves there, and in a very uh, I would say weird, not weird, but a sort of esoteric parallel we see in the war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, the two the two the two families that basic, or rather the two factions in the same family that basically during the war, Sri Krishna as God, he sides with the Kaurava, like with the Pandavas, but the very basic the very basic tactic of Sri Krishna or God in an incarnation is to use Metis as a very subtle means of persuasion and deception in a number of ways. So my simple question was that basically, if God is all-knowing and omniscient, then how does Metis matter to God as such? He obviously, Sri Krishna knows everything about the war, and his ultimatum. So his 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 employment of Metis, uh, like, what are the stakes for it, and uh, why do it? So
Yeah, great. I think that's really ties really well into the comments on cunning and sovereignty, and how it relates and why we might use it, or why it might be used in order to shape knowledge. Fantastic. Okay, so looking at the time. The first myth of Metis is, of course, the ascendance, Zeus's ascendance to absolute sovereign. Metis, in her goddess form, she provides him with the foreknowledge that allows him to predict the habits of Kronos, his adversary, allowing him to deceive him, and ultimately throw him down and put himself in his place. Metis, however, predicts the birth, after Zeus marries Metis, she predicts the birth of a son who will in turn continue the tradition and throw Zeus down. So Zeus somehow, and this is of course maybe the plot hole in the story, is he manages to trick Metis, which is, of course, one has to wonder how you could trick the total embodiment of clever foreknowledge. But he does, and he swallows her. And in swallowing Metis, he absorbs her. He's no longer simply a war leader, a party faction leader, but it's what guarantees his sovereignty. It is the omniscience that it's the degree to which the Greeks granted omniscience to their deity. Their highest sort of patriarch god didn't have the total sort of metaphysical all-knowing of the sort of the Christian God, but rather couldn't be overcome by chance, couldn't be overcome by fortune, was not susceptible to the same shifts and changes and confusions that that mortals are susceptible to, and possessed a sort of incredible cleverness. And in the hands of the sovereign, any deception was seen as absolutely legitimate, because what couldn't be tolerated was a disruption or a disturbing of the political order. So, Zeus is challenged early on by Prometheus on behalf of humanity, who used trickery and deceit to negotiate the ritual of sacrifice in humans' favor. So through trickery, humans burn bones and eat the meat instead of the other way around. Prometheus steals fire and challenges the standing order of political hierarchy, not only throughout the sort of Greek cosmos, but also between the gods themselves and their sort of Titan relatives. Cunning is above all the capacity to perform a reversal, a surprise, which is both a feature of the environment in which cunning operates, but also the quality of a cunning figure. And so the first people we learn about, at least within the Détienne and Vernon text, is the embodiments of cunning. So if we turn back to the epistemic discourse of the present, a very large part, because we've all noted that it's very closely tied to adversarial political rationalities and rationalizations. And I've tried to sort of point us towards three sort of central political concepts around which we can think this: threat or security, power, and rationality, sort of reason-giving or rationalization. So in terms of threats, I think that regardless of where we are in the world of epistemic struggle, it is based primarily, the discourse is based primarily on an adversarial characterization of the political environment. There is a conflict, there is a competition, we have enemies, and the enemies have particular qualities which demand of us certain responses. And the quality of the enemy in epistemic struggle, especially in the present, we look at the lore of intelligence services or the lore of disinformation. I say lore because the history is very poor and it resembles something more like historical rumor. The enemy, who both determines the nature of the situation and our action, is cunning. They have all the capacities of the cunning adversary, whether it's a hero, whether it's a deity, whether it's an animal hunter. The Détienne Vernon gives several sort of clear domains in the semantic field of cunning. So on the one hand, it's a form of primarily it's a kind of knowledge, but a direct access to wisdom, to foreknowing, a sort of prescience, the ability not only to know particular things in advance, but to sense what's coming. If we wanted to naturalize it, we could say that's the domain of abduction that is beyond our conscious control. When we have hunches, when we have intuitions, when we have a sense of what's to come and adapt accordingly in order to achieve a surprising and advantageous result. Cunning was but it was also a characteristic of certain kinds of animals that were either predators, ambush hunters, animals that use trickery or whose form itself is itself deceptive, is illusory. Hunters, of course, one of the most emblematic figures of cunning, people who can reconstruct the path of an adversary by the very subtle signs left in the environment, who are capable of fashioning strange mediating instruments that take the very affordances of the creature, take the being of another, in this case, animal, and turn its very affordances, turn its very being against itself. By knowing the habits of the prey, the hunter is able to design either a situation or a trap that uses these aspects of a target against itself. We see a similar operation come up in the politics of cunning. So political speech, statesmanship, diplomacy, rhetoric, sophistry, where the sophists were derided by Plato and the Platonic school and excluded from the domain of episteme, of science, of certain knowledge, because they purported to be able to teach how to make a weak argument defeat a stronger one by trickery, by appeal to emotion, by certain kinds of figurative language, by strategic and indirect approaches to meaning rather than a direct approach to truth. Artisans, the instrumentality, the ability to produce mediating instruments that can have causal consequences and yet whose motive power remains unknown. Action, self-concealing action. During the Renaissance, during the Machiavellian period, one of the major sort of anxieties, and we see today this anxiety that certain kinds of technology are affording deception, are affording cunning. They're producing this environment in which it's become worse and more possible than ever before. And yet, in the early modern period, this same anxiety about the relationship between instrumentality, artifice, intelligence, deception was there and was a major theme of humanist inquiry. The worry was that by using people as instruments, we contravene some major sort of ethical boundary. But it was also seen that the sovereign used people in the same way that an artificer or an artisan or an architect or some other designer used instruments or created instruments. And of course, at the time, some of the people who worked on the small bits of sort of what we could call theory on this, one being Francis Bacon. These people are also, you know, thoroughly engaged in what we will later see as the beginning of scientific evolution. So questions about the role of abduction and the possibility of political knowledge. Can we even acquire political knowledge? Can we only ever have beliefs or opinions about politics? Is the environment of politics even something that can, about which real knowledge can be posited? You know, these were big questions, as one of the presenters said. You know, even still today, we still sort of it's still contested whether political science, sociology, and other sort of social and humanistic disciplines even count as sciences. And part of the problem is that the domain of politics is one in which it's very easy for participants to find that the context is adversarial. And so we've seen from the Arrigo paper and also from, you know, the contemporary evidence that once you have developed a concept of political relationships in which there is a known or presumed adversary, dangerous, implacable, and in this case, cunning, actors feel compelled to act a certain way. And to address Reda's question about whether epistemic struggle is specifically something in the domain of international politics, or whether it's a sort of broader phenomenon, the way I want to use it is not really as an explanatory theoretical concept. In terms of theory and explanation, I think going into inquiry, going into deception, going into detection, adversariality, I think this is the space in which theorizing will help us understand the specific dynamics of when we're trying to produce political knowledge. What kind of knowledge is it? Well, it's uncertain, and it's in uncertain environments, so we have to rely on abductions, but abductions are weak to deceptions. And if you have an adversary, you will think that deception is prudent and that inquiry should be secret. You know, the way that the deception hypothesis, the adversarial provocation, can lead us into this sort of spiral of adversariality. So I restrict it to cases where, well, where institutions who are responsible for producing authoritative political knowledge start talking about inquiry, about knowledge, about belief, these epistemological issues as an explicit field of political contestation. So of course, knowledge, information, knowing, deceiving, you know, this is not a new thing. In no way is this any kind of like totally novel situation. What's novel is that it's being made explicit and that it's being written into the mainstream discourse of international politics and international security. And if we're going to apply it more broadly, you could say that states are major drivers of this discourse, that they set the narratives, that they set the norms, and that many people will, you know, again, if adversaries, and this is, of course, one of the major sort of philosophical and practical challenges of anyone engaged in politics, especially if you pursue liberatory, you know, sort of like non-authoritarian politics, is like, what do you do about real enemies, right? No matter how committed you are to peace, if you have a real adversary, you can't afford to act like you don't. So, you know, adversaries, people who act like adversaries, always have a sort of weird advantage, and that they can make the first move. They initiate the situation simply by someone conceiving of someone else as their adversary. Compels the other to then act as if they had one out there. And of course, if you're something like a state, what's prudent is not only to worry about real adversaries, but any adversary, to just assume that there's one out there. And that's what intelligence is. Intelligence is an institution that through which the logic of cunning and, you know, adversarial abduction have more or less successfully been rationalized. All of the qualities, capabilities, competencies of cunning in both its ancient Greek sort of cognitive, practical form, right? We have a sort of a model of what kind of actor, what competencies, what cognitive competencies a cunning actor has, and they are excellent detectives, they are excellent deceivers, and they are expert manipulators. And then we have the Machiavellian model, in which that kind of power is seen as a necessary approach to adversarial politics, and that we cannot be merely persuasive on a diplomatic level, and we cannot be merely bellicose with military force, because neither of these will achieve results that are sustainable and that result in the kind of continuation. And so, you might be able to have victory, but you won't be able to sustain your gains. And so cunning and this abductive capacity to adapt to the situation by a constant dialectical movement between discovering new knowledge and sending out false knowledge becomes the main sort of epistemic engine of this kind of political rationality. And I think if we were looking for cunning today, or creative adversarial abduction, places where there are explicit practices and scientific efforts put towards the kinds of inquiry that can only take place within adversarial environments, and how to exploit that, that's the modern intelligence service. It is an institution of Metis. And I think what's really interesting is, like, one of the major questions we've had that sort of come up over and over is, like, can you rationalize this? Can it truly be rationalized? Can we truly bring this kind of activity under the domain of rational thought? Is it truly explicable? And if it is, how? And if not, what happens when we get it wrong? Today's session was about drawing out the shape of our sort of mythological, broad, thematic cultural thinking, Western cultural thinking, about the role of abduction in conflict. And I think that the place we find that is within the discourse of Cunning. And the way that over time, people had the task of thinking about how knowledge, especially political knowledge, could and should be produced, and the role that it played in security, in power, and in political rationality, that we see a consistent linking of abductive competencies and practices and cunning characterizations and adversarial relationships. And that this shifts towards the establishment of political organizations and institutions dedicated solely to the pursuit of epistemic struggle. And of course, the interesting question is, what happens when those ideas leak beyond their boundaries? And I don't really, I think perhaps we can maybe bring that up, the next one, the question about Indian mythology and the use of cunning by deities. I think more than anything, there's a persistent myth everywhere, almost universally, and that's obviously a pretty stupid thing to say, but I still think it's true, which is that when it comes to how absolute power is conceived, there's nothing that's nothing that is forbidden. Absolute power is absolute prerogative. And the question of whether things are off limits or not depends on the rationalization. And if the rationalization is it's necessary, then anything can be rationalized. And so what I want to go on now in the next session and the one after is to continue to look at how, in the next session will be more about theories of war and theories of strategy, and strategy as the linking of tactics to the ends of policy. How very material realities of war have over time been reconceived as epistemological relationships. How the domain of thought and knowledge and communication have been brought into the logic of warfare, and the role of action and the way that is increasingly instrumentalized explicitly, is rationalized, and that while the sort of narrative or quality, the qualitative aspects of Cunning kind of recede into the background, the strong features of Cunning as actual cognitive processes organized around abductive competency, these start to really come to the fore. So I'll put the readings for next week in the folder tomorrow. And thanks so much. We've gone again over time, and I appreciate everyone's sticking with us. I hope that was a good session. I definitely feel a lot better than the first one. I was extremely nervous the first one, but you've all been really great. So yeah, thank you.
That was great, Sam. Thank you. Before we go, just want to remind everybody that we're not meeting next week.
Right.
So we're seeing each other in 2 weeks.
Yes.
And then Sam, maybe at the top of next class, or actually maybe even better over email, you can let everybody know what constitutes an appropriate submission at the end of the class. And
just like not too long.
just not too long.
Don't get too long. Anything too
that's
long is
great.
inappropriate. Everything else is fine.
And just put it in an email so people know, and if they have questions, they can ask you. And then if you want to set your own deadline,
and if
for
I mean,
that.
like long email exchange, if people are really unsure about if they want to write and they don't know what they want to write about, I'm happy to answer some emails. If you think that like a 10-minute phone call or like like Zoom call or whatever would help you figure out what to write about more than a bunch of emails, I'd probably prefer that too. But feel free to get in touch. Yeah, thank you.
All right, great. Thanks, everybody. See you all in 2 weeks.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, BP.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you next time.